Bishop Athanasius Schneider believes the Catholic Church is facing a serious liturgical crisis. In a recent interview, he argued that the modern form of the Mass, known as the Novus Ordo, has moved too far away from Catholic tradition. According to Schneider, the problem is not simply personal preference. He believes the current Mass no longer fully reflects what the bishops at the Second Vatican Council originally intended. Schneider says the document Sacrosanctum Concilium, which guided the liturgical reforms of Vatican II, never called for massive changes or radical innovations. In fact, he points out that the Council specifically warned against introducing unnecessary novelties. But in his view, that is exactly what happened after the Council. He argues that many parts of the modern liturgy were newly created rather than organically developed from older Catholic tradition. Schneider especially criticizes the idea that the Novus Ordo became heavily influenced by modern thinking and Protestant-style reforms. At the same time, he makes an important distinction. He says the first reform of the Mass in 1965 was very different from the later version introduced in 1970. According to him, the 1965 Mass was the true Mass of Vatican II. Why? Because it kept most of the traditional structure intact. The Roman Canon remained unchanged. Latin was still required. The priests still prayed parts of the Mass silently, and most of the older rubrics remained in place. For Schneider, this was a careful reform that respected continuity with tradition. But he believes the later Novus Ordo introduced much bigger changes that created confusion and weakened the sacred atmosphere of the liturgy. So what does Schneider propose as a solution? First, he says the traditional Latin Mass should remain untouched. He argues that this ancient form of worship developed over many centuries and represents a sacred inheritance of the Church. Instead of changing the old Mass, Schneider believes the Church should slowly reform the Novus Ordo until it becomes much closer to the traditional form. In his vision, the modern Mass would still allow more use of local languages, but its structure, reverence, and spirit would become far more traditional. Schneider then outlines several specific reforms he believes are necessary. The first concerns the direction of the priest during Mass. He strongly supports priests celebrating Mass facing the altar, not facing the congregation. This practice is often called ad orientem, meaning toward the east or toward the Lord. According to Schneider, when the priest constantly faces the people, worship can become too focused on the community instead of God. He says the liturgy should direct attention upward toward the divine, not inward toward ourselves. The second reform involves Holy Communion. Schneider believes Catholics should receive communion kneeling and directly on the tongue. He argues that communion in the hand has weakened reverence for the Eucharist and increased the risk of disrespect toward the blessed sacrament. For him, restoring traditional practices would strengthen belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Another major issue for Schneider is the role of women in the sanctuary during Mass. He opposes female altar servers and female lectors inside the sanctuary area. He argues this practice breaks with long-standing apostolic tradition and reflects modern ideological influences rather than historic Catholic worship. Schneider also strongly criticizes modern church music. He believes many parishes have replaced sacred music with styles influenced by pop culture, Protestant worship, or contemporary entertainment. He argues Catholic liturgy should recover more Gregorian chant and traditional sacred music that reflects reverence and transcendence. Finally, Schneider calls for a greater return to Latin. He proposes that every cathedral and major church should celebrate at least one fully Latin Mass every month. He also believes religious communities should regularly use Latin in their liturgy. At the center of Schneider's argument is one core idea. The Mass should feel sacred again. For him, the crisis in the Church is not only theological or moral. It is also liturgical, and he believes restoring reverence, tradition, and sacred worship is necessary if the Church wants to rebuild Catholic identity in a modern world.